Thanks so much for the talks already. Really good to hear them. So I am a philosopher by trade. And if I had a PowerPoint, I'm sorry, I haven't had time to make one, but if I had, I'd start with the following quotation. This is a friend of mine, Janardhan Ganeri. He's a very distinguished philosopher. And he defines philosophy as a distinctive mode of attention. So he says, to do philosophy nowadays is to attend to the way things are by attending to the concepts according to which we understand them. So philosophy itself can be understood as attending to concepts. And this chimes with a definition of philosophy I also really like by Gilles Deleuze, who says that philosophy is the art of creating concepts. So if I was to try to create or at least attend to a concept of attention, I would want to think of a kind of triangulation between attention, value, and love. That would be the structure of the concept. Another concept I've been working on recently, which is closely related to this, is the concept of devotion. And when we hear that, we might think about sort of an emotional, particular kind of emotional attitude. We might think of reverence and religion. But what I mean by devotion is different from that. The word comes from a Latin verb that means to give, to offer, or to vow. So devotion, as I understand it, really means giving yourself to what you love and value, whatever that might be. And when we think about what it means to give ourselves to something, then I think that basically means we give our time, we give our energy, and we give our attention. We give our consciousness, which in a way is all we have, ultimately. It's a very precious resource. And so I'm interested in this idea that when we give our attention, we are, in a fundamental sense, giving ourselves to whatever we attend to. And we can think of various examples of this. Of course, there are examples from religious contexts, but also we might think of a devoted parent who attends to their children. But also, and particularly interesting for me, is the way we give attention to our work. I think that intellectual work, like many other kinds of work, has this very strong devotional aspect to it. We really care about it. We really value it. It's important to us. And we give our attention to it as a way of kind of expressing and registering that value in some way in the world. A philosopher who has a really nice description of this, another French philosopher called Étienne Souriau, who about 70 years ago now gave a really inspiring lecture in Paris called On the Mode of Existence of the Work to be Made. And he has this concept of the work to be made, and he's thinking particularly about an artwork, so say a poem or a novel that doesn't yet exist. It's in the process of being made. But of course, we can also think of our intellectual work like this too. Not just the books we're writing, but maybe also the ideas and arguments we're developing as works to be made. And he talks about the way in which what he calls the work to be made, this virtual object, is very demanding. It wakes us up in the middle of the night to attend to it, a bit like a crying baby, which is another good example of something that's sort of, literally crying out for our attention. So, as you can see, the concept of attention has a really fundamental role to play in this concept of devotion, just as it does in other concepts such as habit and practice, which I've worked on in the past. Finally, that's all quite theoretical. Just to think a little bit more about practices of attention, I'm just coming to the end of a research project that has basically involved running writing retreats for other academics and also for PhD students in my field. And it's been really interesting to experiment with those different forms of intellectual community, taking basically scholarship outside the university. So the retreats have been run in a Benedictine monastery, a space that has a very long tradition of techniques of attention, particularly contemplation. And most of these retreats were silent. So we were silent until late afternoon and everyone was just getting on with their writing. And then when we came together late afternoon, we would just talk about how our writing was going. And there were really two forms of silence that were creating that retreat, those retreat conditions. One was the silence in which we were each individually getting on with our work, not talking to each other, restraining ourselves from email and meetings and so on. But then also we developed a kind of format when we had these gatherings where instead of, we would basically just ask each person to talk about how their day had gone, how their writing had gone, and we would go around and we would just listen. And we weren't debating, we weren't discussing. And that actually created a very different kind of attention than the usual sort of attention that we give each other when we're in intellectual spaces. And that was a really interesting practice that we sort of experimented with. Yeah, so obviously I don't have time to say more, but I'm happy to afterwards. Thank you.